Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. Disclaimer over. Today, I thought I'd talk about something I really don't know a lot about, and that is some American history, specifically in relation to cannabis. I went to this training yesterday. Uh, or I guess when this comes out, it'll be last Friday. I went to a continuing education course that was marijuana, a comprehensive overview. And it really was an overview of all sorts of things about cannabis. But my favorite part was at the very beginning where we talked about history. And I've always had a thing for history. So I thought I'd read the notes that I took on the subject. And there will be some crinkling of paper because I did take handwritten notes. Sometimes I absorb it better that way. And I think this stuff is interesting. So here we go. American history of cannabis. Apparently, it used to be grown for hemp. I don't exactly know what hemp is. You can Google that yourself, but it was used for a lot of things. And by the time that cotton surpassed hemp as the fiber of choice, people had already found multiple uses for cannabis, including smoking it. So then, in the late 19th century, cannabis was used recreationally and medicinally. It was even in just good old fashioned regular American pharmacies. They had those little tinctures. They probably had other things as well, but that's the one that I've heard most commonly. Then in the 1910s, with the Mexican immigration, there came a bunch of cannabis users into the United States. And then in the 1930s, there was another increase in popularity when jazz started to become popular. Also, 1930, so prohibition is over. States start banning cannabis at the state level. But also in 1930 is on the federal level, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was created. And then we move into 1937. We got the Marijuana Tax Act. And I said that funny because it's Marihuna, Huna, Marijuana Tax Act, which basically outlawed cannabis in the US. And so obviously, if something is illegal, use is going to die down just a little bit, and that's what it did. And then we fast forward to the 1950s, there's both the promotion of cannabis use and increasingly tougher laws, including harsher mandatory sentences. So that means that the judge doesn't really have a huge choice. Once you commit the crime, they've got the mandatory minimum sentence and they've got to enforce that. 1960s, and there was an increase in use among white, white, middle, and upper class youth. And so with that increase comes a little bit more socially acceptable within the mainstream population. In the 1960s, we had Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Why did I say Joshua? Maybe because my handwriting isn't that great. Presidents Kennedy and Johnson show that cannabis is not closely associated with violence. So this led to policies including more treatments and not just punishment. Treatment is good. Moving on to my next page of notes in the 1970s, I don't know exactly what year. I probably could have Googled it, but I didn't. NORML is made, and that's NORML. It's a big organization working to advocate for the benefit of cannabis, basically. So 1972 is when the Schaefer Commission recommended decriminalization of cannabis, but President Nixon said, nah, not going to happen. And instead, in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Agency is formed. And just a year before that, in 1972, there were 11 states that decriminalized cannabis. I thought that was surprising. The next year, the DEA was formed. So then we fast forward to 1974, and a socially acceptable magazine was created or founded, and that was High Times. You've probably heard about it. It's a popular publication around the whole culture of cannabis. Then we have the late 1970s. Parents came about. They were always there. But these parents got louder and they lobbied for stricter penalties. Then in 1980, Reagan is elected and the war on drugs really began. I was part of the DARE generation. Just say no. And then in the 1990s, cannabis starts gaining acceptability more in mainstream culture. So I might have said that before, but it was really the 1990s where it was more in mainstream culture. I did forget to mention 1986, or maybe I didn't. I haven't read this part. Okay, so in 1986, this is still Reagan's presidency, and he signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which made cannabis the same level of quote unquote bad as harder drugs, those other Schedule One type things, which off the top of my head I cannot name because I don't know that much about drugs. So then in 1992, and if we give a little bit of context to that, that is 30 years ago from 2022. So 30 years ago, President Bill Clinton, during the campaign, admitting trying, not inhaling, but he admitted trying cannabis, quote, a time or two. So that just shows you how more socially acceptable it was in the 90s. And in 1996, there was one place ahead of all of the other states, and that is the state of California. In 1996, they legalized medical marijuana. And remember, at that time, it was still federally illegal. Actually, currently in 2022, it is currently illegal federally. Presently, though, medical use is legal in 37 states and Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., it's recreational use and legal. Uh, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's right. In Washington, D.C., it's recreational and medicinal, totally legal. And then in 18 states, it's also recreational. So that's interesting. And now it's time for the news. No, not today's news, but news from a century ago. This news comes from April 1st, 1922, and I'm reading from the Washington Times. The biggest news story is Emperor Charles dies, followed closely by Big Bureau shakeup to be aired in Senate. Another reads, practically all coal mines in US and Canada are closed. I guess there was this massive strike and it effectively shut down mining. There's a lot of politics in this issue of the newspaper, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I did not dig super deep. I didn't do a deep dive on this paper. So stay tuned next week, and there will be more century-old news. If you want to support the show, just click the button on the website, and I appreciate y'all just for existing.